For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Or welcome, if it's your first time. I am your host Jay Black, and today I thought it would be fun to do a sort of peek behind the scenes at workshopping an idea. This is something that you don't see or hear many writers talk about very often. And I thought this would be fun, and I also thought that this might work really well for me in terms of ideation and creativity too. So, two birds with one stone a bit. So I've mentioned on the podcast before, though not for a while, that I have a sleep disorder. And when it triggers, sometimes I get these really, really vivid, very strange dreams. And this is actually where hypoxemia came from and why it has that working title. It's a sort of homage to that. Fairly recently, as of recording this at least, I had a couple more dreams like this. Now, these two ideas, I don't know entirely how I feel about them. So that's what we're trying to sort of hammer out today, is try and get some sort of solid-ish concept together from all the various bits and pieces that I remember from these incredibly weird dreams and try and make them into something coherent, because I can tell you the original versions were certainly not. So I've got two. The first one I'm going to work on is a fantasy, because I think that needs more work and might get you a better impression of exactly what this episode's going to be and what sort of things I think about at this sort of really, really early stage. The other one is a thriller stroke horror, probably more leaning towards horror. But without further ado, I think we should just jump into this. So this fantasy project is really incoherent in my brain. There was a lot going on in the original dream. I don't remember tons of it. It was this very weird thing where I was very immersed, but I was also reading a story that I'd written. It was really, really odd. So there are almost two tracks going at the same time. I don't quite know how to square that circle. But the idea is that you have humans somehow enslaved by some kind of fantasy creatures, and they're trying to escape. And the idea, and what eventually sort of came, there was a whole big thing in the early stage that I don't have anymore, but what eventually happened was some other senior fantasy creature of some kind came to join the course, pulled aside, and said, I know this poison you can make, this sort of poisonous food, it looks innocuous. And in my dream, this was like some kind of pizza. It didn't make any kind of sense. It's not going to stay like that, I don't think, because it gets a bit too ridiculous. And this is sort of where the more meta element came in, was I actually had a full-on chapter title, but I just really don't like it at all. It's this idea, I don't know if this is a one-to-one, but the chapter title reads cheeseburger pizza or pepperoni pizza, or what did that guy say again? And that was the sort of vibe I got reading this story, was it was quite sort of, it didn't take itself seriously, it was quite unserious. And while I do want to write something that is almost a bit that unserious and ridiculous, I don't think this is the project for that. Like, there are a lot of things that just don't quite mesh to me. I know the sort of elephant in the room with this writing something unserious is, is the night theatre. I know that's the elephant in the room in the sense of that is not meant to be serious, it's meant to just be fun. But it's not ridiculous. It's not a comedy. And I think I do want to write something that's a bit more like that is something that doesn't take itself seriously and it ends up being comedic with ridiculous chapter titles that are in themselves quite funny. I would quite like to do that because, just because I can. But this is not the project for that when you've got subject matter that's as serious as slavery. That just strikes me as distasteful. I don't want to do that. So I quite like this whole idea down here, but I just fundamentally don't think that fits. I would quite like to sort of have some kind of element of this though and have at least a nod to it, because otherwise it does feel like I'm losing something that was quite underpinning, almost, in the original. The way I'd sort of lean with that is to maybe go in a surrealist direction. Like, maybe that's the way it goes. Instead of it being unserious and ridiculous, you end up with a sort of slightly surreal stroke dreamlike feel to it. That might be the way to go. And that's still, I think, a fun nod to how this project came about. I think that might be interesting. I don't know how to handle that. That's not a problem for this stage of the concept. One of the other key things about this story, the entire sort of main quest is this idea of slavery and sort of hierarchical society, almost. I'd like to have a better view of that at this stage, to sort of try and understand what this looks like. I don't know that I necessarily want to go strictly hierarchical with it, but I also think that would be fun because that's not something I've really done. Particularly, the closest I really get is stuff like military ranks, which comes up in Shadow on the Snow, but not especially, because our POV character, Shinichi, is just at the top, so everyone is beneath him. Besides Colonel, but that's sort of so mild in Shadow on the Snow, it just doesn't come up that much. The obvious way of making this hierarchy work would be different kinds of fantasy creatures, different tiers. So maybe the more fantastical the creature is, the higher up in the hierarchy it is. And that's why humans are at the bottom. Or you could sort of be not ironic about it, I'm not quite sure what the word I'm looking for is, but humans are at the bottom, but these very close to human fantasy creatures, off the top of my head, an elf or a centaur. I think the centaur was the one in the dream. Something closer to that is at the top, and you have the more fantasy stuff in the middle. And that would be potentially interesting. But I don't really know that I like either of those, because I'm not a huge creature person, is the thing. I like creatures in stuff like Project Suncloud, that's just fun, the way that's done. I think I like that a lot. And I've liked creatures in Guy Fawkes' Demon Hunter for the same reasons, really. I'm just not a huge creature person. Outside of horror creatures and folklore creatures that are by and large used in a horror sort of a way, I'm not really that into it. That's one of the sort of few elements of To Tame a Nightmare that I didn't really like, was it was just a bit... there were too many creatures and it didn't really seem to add anything to me. Which is, again, just a personal preference thing. It doesn't detract from the story, it's just like... remind me again why we're doing this, almost. And I don't want to do that myself. I don't like it. I would quite like to do creatures, though, is the thing. I think it would be a good challenge. I think it's also the thing where I don't like it when other people do it, generally, but it might be fun to see what it looks like for me, and if I can have fun writing it anyway, if I can do it in my own sort of a way, because that's a thing that's happened. I might just need to do some creature building here, I guess. My other temptation would be, because if there's one creature I really like, it's sort of ghosts and spirits. That's always fun to me. So what I could do instead is have sort of humans at the bottom, and these fantasy creatures at the top. They're sort of servants, staff, instead of ghosts or spirits. And you could potentially play with a bit of a almost the house takes care of itself type thing. It almost looks like the house is doing things on its own, but it's actually ghosts and spirits that the humans can't see. I like the idea on the one hand of some humans being able to see the ghosts, but I think it's more fun if they can't, and there's a slight psychological element. There's going to be more creatures to do, I think, though, so let's make another one. For what it's worth, I wouldn't usually do any of this, digitally. This would be stuff that I would be doing on pen and paper, but that doesn't really translate to the podcast and how I make that happen without driving myself insane with editing. So I'm doing it digitally instead. It's not making a huge amount of difference, which is quite interesting. It's maybe a bit slower, but that's probably also podcasting while doing it. It's not that different, to be honest. I do want us here in the middle of sort of low creatures somewhere. I just think this would be an opportunity for me to do something like that. And again, this was something that was present in the original concept, and I do want to stick to that. When it comes to exercises like this, it's quite difficult to know what to keep and what to get rid of, because you can't keep everything, because some things don't mesh very well, like this unserious, ridiculous vibe that was there. It just doesn't work for me. The idea of meshing that with something as serious as slavery I just really don't like that, fundamentally. But you also have to bear in mind the reason that this has even stayed as a concept that I would consider toying with. There must be a lot of good material there to begin with, so I don't want to inadvertently lose the thing that's going to be the linchpin, I guess. The obvious answer for the low creatures is to have them as more senior staff who can do things that the spirits can't, by way of the spirits are semi-corporeal. There are bound to be things that they can't do. Perhaps they can't go in water or something like that. I don't know, I've just pulled that out of my arse, that's not going to stay. That would be the obvious role for the sort of low creatures to fulfill, or maybe they're they feel more of a militia type role. Militia, enforcers. That makes sense, actually. I quite like that. Enforcers stroke militia stroke police, something like that. Don't know that I love it, but it works. I'll come back to that as and when, I think. So, low creatures. This isn't technical terminology as far as I'm aware, it's just something that makes sense. I'm actually going to have one for the big creatures as well. I'd like these creatures to be sort of notable, recognisable. Maybe something like a centaur, everybody sort of knows what that is, generally speaking. At the same time, I sort of don't want to do that on principle, because I think I can have more fun and be more imaginative than that. But that's where my head's at the minute. Might come to me doing stuff with the low creatures. I quite like the idea of human-animal hybrids, potentially shifters, but not necessarily human-animal hybrids in the traditional sense of just, for example, human rabbit, you've got bunny ears and a tail, but that's it. Or maybe you've got a rabbit head or something like that. I'd like it to be a bit more horror than that, potentially. Or perhaps just a bit more complicated, a bit more amalgamistic, in potentially antlers, wings, and bird feet, not necessarily arms. But it's sort of also designed to walk on four legs, so it's really clumsy and moves in a really odd and disconcerting way. That could be interesting. That's fun. I really like that. It might be easier to come to that once we have an idea of climate and what sort of setting we're looking at and what animals sort of fit that. That might be easier. Which might make the big creatures make more sense. Then again, maybe part of the point is that they don't fit. And that's why they're notable, because they're sort of there even though it doesn't necessarily make sense. In any case, it looks like setting is kind of the next block. So, setting wise, what am I looking at needing? I need a time period. Rightly, I need an environment. We know there are some woods in there, that's neither here nor there. Because there's this building, the idea of the house looking after itself, I mean, that's kind of appeared out of nowhere. I would quite like some sort of cultural underpin architecturally, some sort of cultural grounding point, mostly for architecture and maybe to influence exactly what setting we're getting. It's not necessarily a cultural touchstone. It might be useful at points, but probably not. My instinct is to say Mongolian. I'm not really sure why, it just is. I would like this building to be big and pretty. I don't know, I feel like if I make things too East Asian, it's a bit of a comfort zone, that's the word I'm looking for. And I don't really want to do that. Now, I don't think there's a bad thing to have a bit of comfort zone, a bit of familiarity in a project like this. But I just don't want it there. And I don't want Beauty and the Beast, so I think that rules out a fair bit of the Mediterranean, just because southern France and bits of the Mediterranean can bleed quite freely, and I just don't want to go anywhere near Beauty and the Beast. So my instinct from there is to go Indian subcontinent, which is not something I've done that much of, actually. I've done, in terms of cultural touchstones, I've done a fair bit of Asia over different projects. I mean, Altan is Mongolian in the Night Theatre, as is Nagui and Hypoxemia. They're both sort of culturally Mongolian. There's a lot of Africa in Hypoxemia, there's a bit of South America in there. Turkey, for some reason, is also there, it made sense at the time. So building a world in a day episode will help you with that one. Not much of the North Americas or Central America, I don't think, but Northern Europe Uh, don't really care for that much, and it's really overdone in fantasy anyway, to be honest. I mean, we all know that. It's just so overdone. Why would I do that unless I'm explicitly aiming for classic fantasy, which I am not? Um, I think Indian subcontinent is fun. I mean, there's a lot I just know about that by virtue of my literal bloodline, so that's relatively easy as well. Loose nods on some Indian myths as well. That could be fun. And Indian buildings can be very pretty. So, I mean, that all fits. I could switch to Bangladesh instead, so it's not just, hey guys, here's India again. But it's such a minor part of things. Realistically, it's going to play such a minor role that I think India makes sense. It makes the poison thing a lot easier as well. In terms of environment, putting India on the map, pun not quite intended, doesn't particularly help because India has such a big landmass. You've got tropics, you've got mountains, you've got this, you've got that, you've got kind of everything. So that doesn't narrow down environment options, which I think is a good thing. Actually, my instinct with this would be the word went out of my head. I mean, I know a word is tiger, but like that is not in common parlance at all. Just like cold forest. I guess not that dissimilar to British or potentially nudging into Norse forests. That's my instinct with anything that's forested. But again, this is comfort zone. That's way too deep in my comfort zone. I think I've just done way too many things like that. I mean, that's Shadow on the Snow at points. That's pretty much everything set in UK. I don't want to do that again. If I don't know, that just seems like a missed opportunity. I don't really want to do savannah or rainforest necessarily either, because again, that just feels a bit too obvious. Something just maybe sort of temperate, sort of almost Mediterranean climate, a bit warmer, isn't necessarily out of place. I would rather go rainforest than cold forest, though. I mean, this is dreamy, surreal, fantasy, whatnot. I can do both. Coldish rainforest, and that sort of helps build the surreal element. Actually, yeah, sure, cold rainforest, why not? And some asshole in the comments is probably going to say, actually, that's called this, it's called tiger, that's the thing, or like, all British forest is rainforest, and I'm going to just say, you know what the fuck I mean? Time period, the original was sort of hunter-gatherer. I don't feel the need to change that. This poison thing makes a lot more sense with Indian food and Indian culture. The obvious answer would be some sort of herbal spice you put in a curry, but like, again, that's way too obvious. That's just, that almost feels like a cop-out, it's so obvious. I'd be more tempted, I think just a really simple, better answer would be paratha filling. And it also has a slight nod to the original being pizza as well, because it's still bread. That would just be the really obvious thing to do. That would be better. I quite like it, to be honest, and it also, is it a spice or is it something? Is it something else? Is it something in the bread itself? Again, I think this is something that's a bit too granular for this stage. But that's cool. I quite like that. What else? Because I do want it to be food-based. It's maybe a bit of a classic, it's also just kind of fun. Cocktails would be the other obvious shout, but I don't know about that. Spiking a drink could be fun though. Because this is going to be quite late in the project, literally just late in terms of word count, page count, I don't feel the need to tie this down particularly. When you get deeper into what the actual story is, how things actually work, something like that sort of happens on its own. I don't think I need to spend a whole load of time on this. Let's go back to creatures for a bit. Let's think about creatures. I mean, the really obvious touchstone at this point is Indian myth. I don't really want to do that though. I'm not particularly interested in the whole idea of the gods are bad and all of that sort of stuff. Like, yeah, it can be fun, but again, it's kind of overdone. I don't think it would necessarily be bad for them to have elements of different gods and things like that. Someone would have the third eye, for example. But I just think there are better places. Stuff like that could be used. Stuff like that could be used in the amalgams. I think better. I quite like the idea of the creatures just being out of place, to be honest. All sorts of somehow undead. That would be interesting. The idea that they have spirits as staff that they would surely be able to see and control. So if they're sort of somehow not quite living but not quite dead, they're sort of somewhere between, I think that's fun. Like, obviously not zombies, because, again, overdone and not particularly interesting. Something a bit more, are you a spirit or aren't you? I think is fun. I don't think that question ever needs to be answered. I think it's more fun if it's not. No hints either way, you can draw your own conclusion, that's fun. I'm also sort of wondering a bit about some of the original ideas I had for Are You Awake Yet? Where the ghost would sort of unintentionally appear to be quite a frightening being at points. Sort of wondering about a sort of shifter thing there, where they can look really friendly and kind, or terrifying. And it's like so frightening it just sort of makes you behave, kind of a thing. But what do I actually want these creatures to look like? I don't love the centaur idea, especially not with Indian myth. It just feels weird. Like, I like the idea of the creatures being out of place. I do. I think that's fun, but it's also just a bit odd given how tightly everything else seems to fit. I just have mixed feelings about that. I'd rather not get into the project with that in mind and go, I'd just rather not deal with that. The other obvious answer to me would be merfolk. It also does come up in the determined ones, though, around Kana, which also has an Indian grounding point. Again, it's like a couple of throwaway moments in Mr. Nakagami that will probably just not be relevant ever again. There's certainly not anything that's going to be plot relevant for a really bloody long time, if ever. So, I really don't think that should matter. It's maybe a nice sort of, if anyone picks up on that, oh, maybe this is a Canaan dream or something. Maybe that's a nice little Easter egg if anyone wants to pick up on it, but I don't know that I love the idea of merfolk. Merfolk is the obvious answer to me, because it's also this idea of luxury. About, oh yes, you're in water. You live aquatically, and that's somehow luxury. But I don't know if merfolk is the way I want to go with that. I don't know, I think I've inadvertently sold myself on the merfolk thing with the whole water as a luxury idea, though. I think I've inadvertently sold myself on that. Sort of weaponization of water. Yeah, no, I like it. Weaponization of water and luxury. There we go. That's fun. Which maybe strengthens the idea of spiking a drink. But also maybe not if they're merfolk. Do they drink if they're merfolk? Who knows? That's not a this stage thing. Amalgam ideas. I'd like to get another one or two of these down just because. You know, again, the obvious answer as soon as you get to India is elephant. I don't want to do it because it's too obvious, and I don't particularly like it because unless you have a trunk, it's not necessarily that obvious what's going on. Again, India has a very diverse climate and diverse set of animals because of it, so there's quite a lot of freedom. I mean, tigers could be fun. Don't want everything to have wings or antlers necessarily. And then you get this sort of interesting clumsy gait thing again, with, you know, tiger legs and paws and claws versus hooves. That's interesting. I like it when things move strangely. I just think that's very effective for something like horror. I mean, I know this is technically fantasy, but it's a bit straddling the line. I'm ending up on the horror side here for sure, but I do not have a problem with that. What would be a fun one? We've got tigers, so I don't really want wolf as well. Also, wolves get memed on, which is sort of a shame because wolves are actually quite cool animals. I do like wolves, and I think they can be fun and they can do a lot of good things. But I'm always genuinely concerned about using wolves just because I get memed on. Do I want something else avian? I mean, it makes sense for the sort of role that these things fulfill. But I also don't want the sort of comically small wings thing, because that's just, again, silly and hard to take seriously. There's something in my head about an eagle and an albatross that sort of... that's not amusing to me, but a bit of a, oh yeah, but that's not something I can talk about. That's massive spoilers. I mean, albatrosses are weird looking things. I had a bit of a phase where I went down a rabbit hole of albatross things, and yeah, they are weird. It also potentially brings in communication between masters quite well. I mean, eagles can fly a really long way, but the albatross is explicitly designed for that. You know what, sure, let's have an albatross. I like them. They're weird and I like them. Massive wings and this really weird shaped beak. Maybe this is something with too many arms. Maybe it just has arms and not legs, so you get a bit of the many arms thing. I mean, monkeys have arms. I'm just trying to think. Most animals I go to have 4 legs. There aren't tons that have arms. I don't know that I really want to do monkeys, but it makes a lot of sense in an environment like this, an Indian climate. It does make a lot of sense, especially since, you know, oh, I can climb up a tree and then fly. That does make a ton of sense. Yeah, okay. Albatross, monkey. God, this is so cursed. And the monkey part is just arms. So we've got wings, a beak, and arms. This is horrific. I guess the other pertinent question to answer in fantasy would be, how fantasy are we going? Because it is leaning pretty heavily towards horror at this point as well. I like the idea of it being fantasy horror, but I don't want a magic system. I don't want it. I don't like magic. I don't think it needs it. I mean, we've got spirits and merfolk and amalgam shifters. That's plenty enough fantasy. Yeah, it slides into a horror direction and a psych element with the ghosts. And potentially a bit of a sort of noir element with the weaponization of water. You get the sort of surrealist thing, which is also more fantasy than anything else. Fantasy stroke psych, but yeah, I think that's plenty. I mean, this is a more solid concept than I would usually have at this sort of stage. But as soon as you get into creatures and all of that, this isn't really something I've done before. So I just felt like I needed a bit more work on that. Okay, I'm realising something I missed. And that is Full House tricks. We know that this is going to be a novelette, give or take. That's the sort of length we're looking at. But what tense POV and all of that do we want? What do we want for Full House tricks here? Because where it sits in the grand suit is just obvious. Again, this is a point where some familiarity would be helpful. I think because there's a psychological element, first person makes a lot of sense. And also the surreal, dreamlike thing. Yeah, I think we go first person. It just makes way too much sense not to. Present or past tense. First person past is something I want to experiment with. And past tense works nicely for something like fantasy. Does it kill the tension a bit, though? It's always the thing I think with first past. I mean, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I think I maybe run the risk of it a bit here, because I feel like time pressure is going to be a thing with the idea of escaping and urgency. That sort of thing just works a bit better in present, if you ask me. Yeah, I think present tense is probably the answer here, and again, a bit more familiarity on that doesn't hurt. POV. It can be really fun to have antagonist POV. Again, this is something that's done really well in Poison and Opium. That can be fun. But I don't think in a story like this it is. Because in Poison and Opium, what's fun about that is that you get the point of view of an antagonist who in many ways wants the same thing as the protagonists. They want to bring down the Empire, but for different reasons, in a different way, and what they would replace the Empire with is not the same. So it's the sort of, it's the contrast, it's the similarities and the differences, and realising that no, the antagonist is not a good person, but you can see where she's coming from. I don't think in a story like this that's particularly valuable, because, I mean, they're elitist slavers. You know what would be really fun, actually? Is to have multi-POV, but not in the traditional sense. Multi-POV is a passing of the baton, and those are your consequences. You know, characters die routinely and without mercy, and when they die, the baton is passed. That's a fun idea. I've not done that before. Multi-POV baton, hell yeah. That's really cool, actually. Okay, yeah, this is definitely a goer. This is going to be a lot of fun, actually. I really like this idea now. Yeah, I really like this. So what I'd like at this stage is a working title. This is just a keeping track of things thing. I think I did do an episode all about working titles. I'd like one for this. Oh boy. I mean, we've got amalgams, we've got merfolks, we've got slaves, we've got poison, we've got India. What does that give me? creatures, India, slavery, poison. Kind of wanted a bowl of mac and cheese type title, but not. Of Poison and Chains? Something like that. Well, it's sort of a fantasy title, but it would have more horror type art. I don't like Poison and Chains particularly, but that sort of vibe. Well, there's weaponization of water, so maybe it should be of water and or of something underwater. So let's scroll all the way down to this. This is the sort of linchpin here is this idea of child abduction stroke occult. Potentially could be the same thing, I don't know. But I actually have this whole idea of this opening scene and story arc. So the idea would be that there's a travelling circus, almost. Maybe not quite that, but maybe exactly that, I don't know. That comes to this sort of remote country bumpkin type village. And then the ringleader says to the parents, hey, I'm heading out pretty soon, but if you want, if you all looked really impressed by this, so I can bring these kids with me, and the next time you see me, these kids are going to be, professional, they're going to be amazing, and, we're going to make lots of money and all of this sort of stuff, and parents are like, hell yeah. Obviously the children have no agency in this, and that's kind of the point. And the idea is also when the children do sort of return, in quotes, as professionals, but it's not actually them. Like, it's people disguised as these children. Potentially, people with dwarfism who are also exploited here. Potentially part of some sort of cult or something. And of course it would be child POV, so you get the real horror element of it. Yeah, this one's really dark. But this is like really sort of old school, covered wagon Oregon Trail type era, so it's not a time when people are watching their kids or necessarily even care about their kids that much. The idea of a travelling circus came a bit later on. This was a much shorter dream, and this was about as far as it went. I only really got the opening scene and the sort of impressions building from that. Travelling circus, I'm not sure is necessarily correct, but I also like it. That's not something I've done before, and I think it's fun. To be honest, I sort of, looking through this again, I don't think this needs that much work. I mean, we've got a time period, we've got, very clear story and vibes, and all of these sorts of things. I guess something to work out. I mean, it's much more in horror than thriller, I think. I would say horror plus thriller to an extent. A lot of it is sort of. A lot of the theming seems to stem around children's agency and how people get used. We've maybe got a cultural grounding point to figure out here, because I don't necessarily just want the Oregon Trail and Travelling Circus. Though I don't hate it in this context, actually. But I don't know that I want to go there. So it's a cultural grounding point. Full house tricks. I mean, I know broadly what I want my POV character to be, but idea of the size of this might not be a bad plan. Is it not size of the project, that sort of short story novelette looking like? It could be longer, but it probably won't be. I mean, I underwrite anyway, so maybe it ends up being longer, maybe it doesn't. It seems like a pretty tight story though, so trying to flesh out this cult idea would be good. I sort of don't know about a cult. I wonder if that's sort of spoiling it. Also, what does this ringleader want out of the children exactly? I think that's sort of the main question, actually. What point is there in abducting these kids? Obviously, this man is not looking for ransom. There's maybe just a sort of scam thing about give me your children at a deposit and you'll make it back. And it seems like that's true. Travelling circus. It's like there's some sort of money laundering or something going on there, I would imagine. That's not going to be particularly important, I don't think. I mean, it's fairly easy to get that undertone in there, just, this looks like some dodgy business stuff, and it's not exactly a plot hole, is it? I mean, if this guy is abducting children and exploiting people with a medical condition in order to enable that, I'm gonna just say that that's not where the crimes end. I don't think the idea that this man has money and it doesn't really make sense, it's not clear where that came from, I don't think that should be in any way a plot hole. It's not necessary, it's not really a surprise, it's a bit like a 50-year-old politician knows a mercenary, that just makes sense. You don't really need an explanation for that. But so what is there in abducting kids? He's not asking for ransom. He's got money in other ways. Also, I feel like if there was a travelling circus abducting kids and then asking for a ransom, word would get around about that, and that actually actively does not make sense. So, I mean, there is an obvious answer, and I don't know that that's necessarily the wrong direction to go in. I sort of also wonder about the idea of cannibalism, though. Sometimes I say things and then realise how they sound. It's potentially an interesting sort of twist, because it's not necessarily what people would expect. And this isn't me trying to go, ooh, subversive expectations, it's just trying not to make things stock and obvious. I'll write that down. I don't love it, but it's an option. What else could there be? I mean, it could play into the financial scam. And the idea that maybe these kids are sort of being used as beggars or something like that. Sort of Slumdog Millionaire type style. I mean, the sort of cannibalism idea could feed into a cult idea. Blood sacrifice or something like that. I don't want to lean into a satanic panic or really anything like that, though. I don't know, I don't want this one to be too complicated, and introducing an entire ass cult into that does feel counterproductive. I don't really like it. I like a good cult, but I don't think this is the right place for it. I think it just gets a bit too big. It starts to get a bit unbelievable. You've got this travelling circus that abducts children and has a whole load of financial scammery, presumably political scammery going on as well, sort of by extension. Dragging a cult in as well makes it all feel a bit too big and maybe slightly unbelievable that people don't know about this. I mean, yeah, it's the Oregon Trail, information doesn't really travel sort of days, but it starts to get a bit too big. I'm not having a cult, I don't think. I think that's just a bit too much. So cannibalism starts to make less sense. I mean, maybe the point is that it's kind of unclear. You know, this is a child, and they're not going to find out everything, they're not going to understand everything. When I say child, I do mean age 10 absolute maximum. So maybe it actually doesn't make sense for the kid to figure this out. I don't think that's a good answer in the sense of I should know what's going on. But maybe that's how it looks on the page. I think that's Like, there's more than one answer you can come to. Maybe it's a serial killer thing. That could also be a part of it. I don't know if that's necessarily the wrong answer. So, I mean, how big is this whole travelling circus entourage? Is my question now. Because, I mean, you've got animals, you've got performers, you've got the ringleader, and you have kids. I think there should be an immediate red flag in the sense that these are the only kids. And shouldn't there be more? Surely they're not that special that it's only this town, but they've just so happened to have taken a whole load of kids. That just doesn't make sense. Like, from the POV character, and it's like, hang on, that seems like a bit of a red flag. But that's sort of, kids like to believe that's special type thing, so I quite like that as an idea. It's like, there are red flags around. I mean, there are as many performers, I think, as children abducted. Like, it should be 50-50 in terms of that. So, and again, there's only so big this sort of thing can get before it gets a little bit ridiculous. So, not that big. And, maybe your ringleader man, maybe a lot of his time is spent being a caretaker to the animals. Maybe that's seemingly what he does, and he actually doesn't look like he plays that big a role. He's just the showman and the animal guy, and that's a bit weird in its own right. Maybe there really aren't as many people there as you might think. In my brain, you were sort of are chosen to, get special lessons by the ringleader, and then you're not seen again. And that's where the unclear part comes in. And the POV character is just not good enough. The POV character never experiences that. And it's about the uncertainty. It's building, the ending happens on its own type thing. I don't think that's something I should figure out at this stage. I don't like knowing how a project ends. In the concept stage, I don't like that at all. I don't know if I like not seeing the answer. There's a time and a place for that sort of ending. Maybe this is it, maybe this isn't. That's not something you know until you're deeper into something like this. But yeah, this one feels pretty solid. So, again, this is a horror, so first person just makes sense. I think present tense, again, makes sense. Again, sort of urgency, tension, amount of stealth and whatnot, it just makes sense. I like single POV here. The point is the mystery. Single POV makes sense. Cultural grounding point. I quite like Oregon Trail. I'm going to be honest, but don't know that I want it to be American. I think Oregon Trail, but again, the kids are sort of used to travelling. Maybe that's an element as well. Oh, we're going that way, but we've just arrived here, we don't necessarily like this place, let's talk about leaving, why don't we just get out? We can get away from our annoying parents as well. Maybe there's an element of that. My instinct is Oregon Trail, but Canadian. I don't know why. Don't know that I like that. I also get a bit of a Michael Morpurgo type vibe to this, which is a bit left field. So maybe Oregon Trail, but British? I mean, this is just a tight, relatively small scope story. So, yeah, I don't know, I think that's pretty solid, actually. Yeah, no, I like this one. Yeah, it's super dark, but I think this could just be a really interesting project to work on, something like child POV. It's not really something I've done. I mean, granted, Osama was 16 in Count the Stars, and Curtis will be a bit younger. In Amber Shackles, he'll be 14, 15. But these are both people who grew up pretty fast and pretty young, so there are sort of hints of it, but it's not massively there. And this is, child. We're talking 8 to 10-year-old. So this is something very, very different. Yes, first present single just because that's what makes sense with the genre and story. But travelling circus, Oregon Trail, all of that sort of stuff, and explicitly talking about sort of children's rights, children's issues, this is also just not really something I've done. So how that would work from a child POV, I think this will be interesting to work on. That's a working title for this. Quite like Cirque de Sombre, just because that sounds nice. Yeah, I'll know what that is. That's the main thing. Maybe it gets me to an actual title. But I think that is about it for today. We got 2 projects that are both goers, actually. I really didn't expect that to happen. I thought the horror thriller would be. I didn't think the fantasy would be a goer, so that's actually really cool. And that's genuine as well. There's a good chance I do another episode like this, because I actually do feel like this really worked for me. So maybe keep your eyes peeled for that, and the best way to do so is just to subscribe. That's the easiest way to know what's coming, genuinely. Alternately, Instagram is also a good option, because at some point I have to decide what the episode for the week's going to be, and that's the place where it gets announced. So on Instagram, I'm Jade_Black21. I'm also Jade_Black21 on Pinterest, and there you can find a whole bank of snippets from my published works. You can kind of see what the places I write about sort of look like. There's exclusive art, there's world building, there's all sorts of stuff over there. So if you like this episode, that might be a fun place for you to check out. If you want to see semi-live updates on what I'm writing, then Twitter is the place to go. I'm JBlack21 on there. I do writing updates just about every morning, and I also host the monthly Thrills prompts. I've also been writing some micros on there as well, which is pretty fun. I also exist on Blue Sky, JBlack21, but I don't really use it. If you're so inclined, you could follow me on there if you so choose. But for now, I've taken up quite enough of your time, so I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, or commenting, or subscribing. It really does help the channel a lot. All music is done by me. Copyright JBlack 2025.